we're going to kind of go over ferns in general. We're going to talk about what are ferns, just where are they kind of in the plant world, as well as a little bit about their life history, their reproduction, their diversity, worldwide diversity. And then we're going to dig into fern anatomy, which sounds scary, but it's really important because we use that to identify these. And then I'm only going to get into 10 common woodland ferns. So that doesn't sound like that many, but I think that's plenty to kind of cover. And I counted it up, and over the course of the whole presentation, I'll actually mention about 30 different ferns, but we'll cover in detail 10 of what I think are the common woodland ferns. Alrighty. So what are ferns? We kind of know by looking at them, you know, a fern when we see one, if you will, but just kind of figuring out where they fit in the plant world. They are vascular plants, so they have, you know, xylem and phloem. They move materials that way, but they're non-flowering, so they don't produce flowers. Instead, they reproduce via spores, and that makes them a little different than a lot of the other plants. Historically, you may have heard the terms used to describe ferns, cryptogams or tritiophytes. So if you look at those, a cryptogram literally means hidden seed. So crypto is hidden, gam is seed. So it means cryptogam is a hidden reproduction. So in other words, a non-seed bearing plant. Now the term tritiophyte, it transliterates to feather. So pteron, teritio is a derivative of pteron, feather, and phyte, of course, means plant. So this term tritiophyte was used to describe ferns as literally feather plants. So if you look at a picture of a fern, that makes sense, right? I can kind of see that that where you could get that the feather plant out of that. Well, let's look at taxonomy here. And so this is a very much reduced and simplified kind of tree for the kingdom, the plant kingdom. And so in here, you can see we have kind of 4 major divisions of plants. We have the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. Those are all non-vascular plants. And then we have these tracheophyta, the vascular plants. And so inside this group of vascular plants really feels a lot of what we consider plants today. We have our seed-bearing plants all the way on the right there, the spermatophyta. And so those are our conifers, our flowering plants, will be our trees, our grasses, sedges, wildflowers, kind of all fit into that group. And then we have these other 2 groups that I've put up here, the lycopods and the ferns and horsetails. And so really ferns fall under that vascular plant group, but are separate from those seed bearing. Remember, they're non-flowering, they're non-seed producing plants. And so they kind of fall into these other 2 groups, the lycopods and the polypodiophyta, the ferns and horsetails. And if you look under those, there's kind of 5 major groups here that fall into what we consider ferns or fern allies. And that gets a little confusing there. But overall, you know, the true ferns and the grape ferns, we consider those to be ferns, and all of these others, the horsetails, the club mosses, and the quillworts, we call fern allies. Again, that's a little strange. We won't really cover fern allies in this presentation, but instead just know that that group in general, the fern allies, they have a lot of the same reproduction strategies. They produce spores. They kind of have a lot of the same life history as the true ferns or the grape ferns, but they're different enough that they kind of move them over into their own category. Again, for today, we're going to be talking about the true ferns. But this whole group, ferns, fern allies, this group of ferns here, you know, this is an ancient plant lineage. It first appeared somewhere around 360 million years ago. Compare that to flowering plants. So our wildflowers, our conifers, all those. Those showed up about 160 million years ago. So these were really early plants, been around for a very, very long time. And some of their heyday, of course, was back in the Carboniferous period. And in those situations, we had full-on tree-sized ferns, right? So most of the plants kind of fell into this group. Large plants, small plants, again, the kind of heyday of the Carboniferous period was dominated by fern or fern-like plants. And this lasted for a very long time. In fact, if you look at, and these are some neat pictures from the Illinois State Geological Survey, and this is a Pennsylvania era fossil forest they found in some Illinois coal mines from back in the day. And they kind of did a really neat project mapping out this historic, huge forest. And if you're ever interested in it, Google for that, you know, fossil forest, Illinois fossil forest, and read some of the stories behind it. But you can see some of the fossils they found were tree ferns or these giant horsetails, which are foreign allies. And so it's just kind of neat showing that many, many, many years ago back in Illinois, we had a lot of these ancient fern forests, if you will. But in terms of extant ferns, where we are in the world, ferns are a fairly diverse group. They're not as diverse as some of the other plant groupings. But overall, there's about 10,000 species of fern worldwide, and only about 400 or so species in North America. And then if you get into Illinois, we're a little over 80 species, depending on how you count the taxa here. So again, overall, not a diverse group compared to some of the other types of plants we have in the state, but still plenty, you know, 80 some species. Overall, ferns in general are a tropical or a subtropical group. That's where the heart of their diversity in the world exists. And in fact, about 80% of the worldwide fern species grow in these, you know, moist to really wet tropical or subtropical regions. 40% or so are in subtropical or montane rainforest. And you add to that about 30% in tropical rainforest, and then throw another 10% in the tropical deciduous forest. That's where we get that 80% that really grow in that tropical or subtropical region. Once you get out of that region, the number of ferns really drop. Here in the temperate forest, even up into the tundra or alpine, there's only about 15% of the worldwide fern species grow there, and only about 5% are grow in temperate grasslands or temperate deserts. But ferns in general, if I'm kind of zeroing in here to Illinois, they do grow in a lot of different habitats in Illinois. You can find ferns growing in many different places. So a lot of our ferns grow on rocks, right? And so this is Virginia polypody. You find it growing on sandstone. Other ferns will grow on limestone. And so a real classic example of that is our purple cliffbreak fern, which you'll find growing, and you see it on rocks. You can almost guarantee it's on some type of limestone. And then we have other ferns that grow in soil and grow kind of exclusively in soil. You'll find them growing that way. Broad beech fern is a good example of that. And then we have a whole host of ferns that kind of do either one of those. They may be found growing on rocks. They may be found growing in the soil or somewhere kind of in that transition zone. And so a lot of our ferns fall into that kind of both category, if you will, of rocks or soil. And so think about lady fern or our shield ferns. They kind of fit that category where you may find them growing out of the rocks, but you may find them growing in the soil. Cinnamon fern's another example of that. And then we have some aquatic ferns. This is one good example here. This is mosquito fern. So in this picture here, I really enjoy this picture. This was taken at the Cache River State Natural Area down here in Southern Illinois. But the larger plant, the kind of dark green with the black speckles, that is a frogbit native plant. And then you see the bigger of the light green rounded plants, that's duckweed, which we should be all familiar with. The tiny little ones in between, so that's watermill. And then the rest of it, that kind of sagey green, dark gray green plants, those are tiny floating ferns, mosquito ferns that occur in stagnant waters throughout parts of Southern Illinois. Really, really an interesting plant. Sometimes you can find areas where it's just 100% covered in this tiny mosquito fern. There's some ferns that are epiphytic. And so this is resurrection fern growing in actually on a tree here in Illinois. And so these are, again, epiphytic plants. They grow on other plants. They call this one resurrection fern because it tends to dry up and shrivel in dry conditions, but will resurrect itself when it gets a little bit of water and green right back up. I mean, it kind of reminds you of those live oaks from down south with the Spanish moss and the resurrection fern on them, but we do have some of that in Illinois. And then not in Illinois, but close, so I figured I would mention it, is we actually have some vining ferns. So the one in the picture is Japanese climbing fern. So it's a true vine. It can get to 30 or 40 feet long. We also have a native climbing fern or viney fern called American climbing fern, Lagodium palmatum, that just doesn't make it into Illinois. But if you get into Kentucky and parts of central Kentucky, it makes it that close to us. So just another neat growth form for ferns. So I thought it was worth mentioning here. So again, very, very diverse. Lots of different types of ferns out there. They grow in a lot of different types of habitats here in Illinois. So let's get into a little bit more about the life history of ferns, how they reproduce. And ferns in general, if you're used to normal plant propagation, normal plant reproduction through pollination and pollen, this is a little different. It's a little bit confusing. So ferns in general have two major strategies for reproduction. There's the sexual reproduction, and that's actually two different growth forms in a fern. And we'll talk about that here in a minute, sporophytes and gametophytes. And then there's also asexual reproduction, which some ferns will do either through bulblets or fernlets or spread via rhizomes. But let's focus a little bit on this kind of typical fern reproduction. So again, it's not the same, and people think spores are kind of like pollen, and they're really not, or they think they're kind of like seeds, and they're really not that either. So they're really different. So a typical fern that we think of growing, that's called a sporophyte generation of a fern. That's the ones that are big, identifiable, produce spores. So a sporophyte is a diploid organism. So it has both sets of chromosomes, right? And spores, when they come off of, they get released by ferns, are haploid. So they only have half the chromosomes. So they release spores. They don't land on another fern and pollinate like that. Instead, those spores will land. And if they have the right kind of habitat, kind of moist, wet habitat, they'll actually start growing, and they'll grow a haploid organism. So it's half the chromosomes growing out of that, right? So it's not a diploid, not a normal fern. Instead, it's this little thing we call a prothallus or a gametophyte, and it really needs very specific conditions to grow. So the vast majority of spores never make it, right? That's why ferns produce millions upon millions of spores, cast them wide, hoping that some will make it. If they land in the right environment, it's wet environment, they're able to grow, they'll form this little prothallus, this little gametophyte, and they're about the size of your pinky nail. Tiny, they almost look like a little liverwort. You really can't recognize what they are in that situation. But again, this tiny little thing. And then as that grows, that gametophyte, that prothallus, some will produce male gametes from them. And so those gametes are kind of like sperm, and they'll actually can move through this wet environment. It can almost swim around, and they try to find another gametophyte that has the female gametes in there. And then at that point is where they get fertilized, right? So after the spores are produced, they have to grow a gametophyte. The gametophyte has to grow and survive. And then it releases these male gametes. It finds another gametophyte with female gametes. They fertilize each other. And once that happens, then you get back to that diploid, right? So you get half of the chromosomes from the male gamete, half from the female gamete. So you have that diploid, and it starts to grow a sporophyte again. It actually starts to grow what we consider a new fern. So there'll be a little root that comes out of that gametophyte. There'll be a little sprout that comes out. And as that new fern grows, that gametophyte will kind of wither away and disappear, and it grows a new fern. And then that fern will release spores and kind of start the thing all over again. So kind of weird, kind of neat having these two different growth types, these two different generations out there, but it adds a couple extra steps from what we consider the normal kind of flowering plant reproduction. Just another look at it here. Again, basically growing from a sporophyte, which is what we typically recognize as a fern. The spores will grow into a gametophyte, and if it's fertilized, then it'll grow a new sporophyte. Here's some neat pictures that I found from a publication with the Forest Service. The one on the left there, you can see this really young, newly growing gametophyte, and you can see the tiny little spore in the bottom split open and starting to grow that. And then on the right there, you can see one that's kind of well developed and growing on a wet, rocky surface. And then here you can see a gametophyte on the left that's just starting to grow a new sporophyte, so a new fern in that case. Again, as that grows, it'll form roots in the ground, and then that gametophyte part of it will kind of wither away over time as it forms a new sporophyte or a new fern, what we consider a fern. So again, most of the spores are just lost to the wind and lost to the environment. It kind of has to have these very specific conditions to grow, and then very specific conditions to be able to be fertilized. But because of this free living stage and the wind dispersed of these spores, we get a lot of mixing of ferns. So there's actually a ton of hybridization in fern groups. And so this is just one example here of our spleenworts. So spleenworts are a group of ferns, and you don't need to know this stuff here, but in general, just to show you that all of these are kind of stable hybrids that can be found in the environment just from this one group of spleenworts. And so ferns do a lot of hybridization, certain groups more so than others out there, which can make ID a little difficult at times if you find some of these hybrids. But as I mentioned, there are asexual reproduction strategies with some ferns. Many of our ferns, and I think when I get into the ID, I'll mention them, which ones will do this and which ones won't. But many of them have rhizomes, and they'll form these kind of big patches of ferns and reproduce that way. But a few have other strategies. So on the left there is walking fern. Again, one of my favorite ferns, and it actually produces fernlets. So if you see in that picture, we have the fern comes up, we have this frond that comes out, this long skinny one, and when the tip of that frond touches back into the ground or to a suitable habitat, it can actually reroot and form a brand new fern. So here's a little fernlet that's rooting and growing out of the tip of this fern. And so that would be asexual reproduction. It would be genetically the same as a parent, but it's a different way of spreading around. It doesn't rely on gametophytes. On the right, this is bulblet fern. And so it's similar in the sense, instead of producing fernlets, it produces little bulblets. So you see that little string with the little ball, the little bulb at the bottom of it. That's actually a little tuber or a bulbul, if you will, that the plant produces. It can drop off and then grow a new fern straight from that. That would be basically a clone of the adult. So again, just a different strategy, a different way, but several ferns will kind of do this asexual reproduction as well. Kind of neat stuff out there. Let's move into fern anatomy. And so this is important because the terms we use with ferns are a little bit different than the terms we use for other plants. So when you're looking at identifying ferns, it's a good idea to kind of know what's called what. And so overall, with ferns, the full leaf, if you will, of a fern, including the stem all the way up, we call those the fronds. So a fern frond, again, would be the stem all the way from the base of the roots throughout the whole entire, what we consider a leaf. So that's the frond. The leafy portion of the frond, that's the blade, and then the stemmy portion, so the stuff below that's kind of like a stem or a petiole, we call that the stipe. So the stipe and the blade together make the full frond, if you will. Look at that again. So here in this picture of this hairy lip fern, what we're seeing there is the blade, because we can't see the lower stemmy part, the petiole or it's called the stipe. And so the blade itself is the leafy part of the frond. And then the stem, the stipe that comes up, is in the middle of the leafy part. For some reason, it gets changed and it's called the rachis at that point, right? So we have the rachis, which is the stem part of the blade. And then if the if the fern is divided further, the frond, the blade is divided into further leafy parts. Each of those leafy parts are called pinna, or together pinnae. So the pinnae would be kind of like a leaflet on a tree leaf, right? So it's a division of the full frond. Now, if those pinnae are further divided, then each of those little subdivisions are called pinnules, right? So that's just, again, lots of little bit different terminology. It's kind of annoying that they use different terminology, but it's good to know it, right? So overall, the full thing is the frond, and then the leafy part is the blade. And then if it's divided further, those first divisions, those leaflets, are pinnae. And if it's divided a second time, then it's a pinnule. But let's look at it one more time. Overall, with this Christmas fern, the full thing, including the stipe on the bottom, the stem, is the frond. The leafy part is the blade. And if you get up there close and look at this plant, the stem in between all these pinnae in the leafy part, that's a rachis. And then the leafy subdivisions, if you will, are pinna. One is a pinna, and all of them together are called pinnae. And this plant, which is lady fern, is further divided. So each of the pinnae, are divided again, and each of those little ones are called pinnules. So instead of leaves and leaflets and subleaflets, we have blades and pinnae and pinnules. And here for this shield fern, we have each one of those divisions is a pinna, and then each one of those subdivisions is a pinnule. Again, it's important to know because that's the terminology we use, and we're going to use that when we get into ID. But just kind of know those are the terms when we're talking about them. That's what we're talking about. Ferns often develop through unrolling or unfurling as they grow. And so I'm sure you've all heard the term fiddlehead. So a fiddlehead or a crozier is kind of a developing, unfurling fern. So here's two different examples, fragile fern and Christmas fern, kind of both showing that fiddlehead nature in there. Just kind of neat, I thought. Some do it more distinctly than others out there. So let's jump into the spore producing part. And again, this is important because the shape, the location of the spore producing parts are very important for identifying ferns. Sometimes that's the key primary characteristic to look at to tell one fern from another. And so there's kind of four terms to know about this. So the spores themselves, those are the little propagules that spread out. Those are microscopic. You're not really going to see those at all. The kind of engine that produces those spores, that's called a sporangium. And so those are usually little, really tiny. They might be spherical. They may be on a stalk, but they're very, very small. And so the sporangia, which is plural for sporangium, those are the factory that produces the spores. When you have a cluster of sporangia together, that's called a sorus. And so plural is sori. So the sori occur on the ferns in kind of predictable ways and maybe different shapes, different locations. So that's the primary unit that we use to describe this in a fern is what does the sori look like? Where are the sori located? Now, a lot of times there's a membranous covering that's over these sori, and that's called an endusium. And so sometimes it's attached on one side or sometimes it's attached at the end. Sometimes it's thick or thin. So the endusium or that cover is something else you'll hear mentioned a lot with fern identification. So the sporangia produce the spores. The sori are a cluster of the sporangia, and they may be covered with an endusium. So here's one look at that. So this is glade fern, another one of my favorite ferns here to Illinois. And you can see that it has a sporangia that is long, kind of linear in shape, that's partially covered, or sorry, a sori that's long and linear in shape, partially covered by an endusium. And you can see the sporangia in there are those little tiny black spheres that are actually producing the spores. Another example here, the sori of this Tennessee bladder fern are more rounded. The indusium is light green and attached at one side, right? So, and it occurs kind of along the veins on the underside of the pinnate. Another example for walking fern, this is a mature sporangia. So you can see they're kind of brown and rusty. That's common as they get older and really start releasing spores. But you can see they're long and kind of occur all throughout the underside of the leaf. Just another example. And then some sporangia are just kind of spread out, so there's not really a definable sorus in there. So this is Christmas fern, which kind of has the sporangia all over or in two rough lines down the middle of the pinnate there. Again, different looks out there. These characteristics are used very often for identifying ferns. And just another one to get into. So this is netted chain fern. It has these long kind of cigar-shaped sori that are completely covered tightly with a black indusium. Now, as they mature, that'll split open and let the spores out, but they call this chain fern because these sori do kind of look like chains going along the underside of each of the fronds here. So with ferns, where these sori occur can vary depending on the species. And so many species will have fronds that kind of always produce sori, always have sori on them. So they only have fertile fronds. Or they'll have sterile fronds that never produce sori that look basically identical to the fertile fronds. And so there's really no separation. But there's quite a few ferns that have very big differences between the fronds that carry the sori and produce the spores. So those will be the fertile fronds, and the fronds that don't produce any sori or spores at all, and those will be called sterile fronds. So in those cases, there's really a division of jobs, if you will, between the two types. And so this is a great example here with cinnamon fern. You see the sterile fronds are the big photosynthetically active fronds, the big green fronds that grow and collect energy. So those produce no spores at all. You flip the underside of those leaves of those fronds and you won't find any sori on them. They're just a kind of an energy producing photosynthetic machine. And then compare that as those sterile fronds to the fertile fronds, which are the spore producing ones. And it's those long ones that are really contracted and tight. So in that case, their job is to send the spores out far and wide. So oftentimes a fertile frond is going to be taller to get up above all the leafy sterile fronds, so it can send its spores out and about wide. And oftentimes they'll be kind of contracted like that where the leaves are really tiny. So again, some are that way, some aren't. And so we use that to know, are there separate sterile and fertile fronds, or are they kind of the same? Another great example here would be a cutleaf grape fern, also called bronze fern. And you can see it has two different fronds, and basically each plant is made up of two fronds. There's one sterile frond, which you see on the bottom there, which again is the photosynthetic one. And then this tall, erect one that produces the spores, the fertile frond. It's up high so it can send the spores out. Many times, a lot of these ferns, the fertile and the sterile fronds are kind of separated in time as well, where the sterile fronds, the leafy fronds, if you will last a lot longer, will be out kind of all season collecting energy. And then when the time is right, they'll produce a fertile frond that to produce the spores. And then many times that'll dry up or even wither away and go away. So a lot of times when you're looking out and identifying ferns, you'll only have sterile fronds. Sometimes the fertile fronds won't be there at that time of year. Another one that just looks very, very different, and then sometimes it's even separated in space by a little bit, would be sensitive fern. So it's one of those rhizomatous ferns that produces these big patches. And so a lot of times you'll have the sterile fronds, the leafy fronds, kind of growing everywhere. And then you'll have these little clusters of fertile fronds coming out near them, but kind of separated a little bit. So sometimes it's almost difficult to connect them as the same individual sometimes. But again, not all ferns have that, but some do. So when they do, it's important to know if you flip over a leafy green frond and you see sorry on the bottom, spore producing areas, then you know it doesn't necessarily have these separate fertile and sterile fronds. But again, we're looking at this as the shape, the location of these. For example, Christmas fern has only the end of the fronds will be fertile and the rest will be sterile. And then others will have different shapes, different sizes of sorry on them. And that's all very useful for identifying these ferns and one of the key characteristics. Another important characteristic is, again, the way that these ferns are, the fronds are divided. And so again, this is a lot of detail here, but it's really important because we describe ferns this way in terms of how it's kind of, think of it as leaf arrangement on a tree, right? We want to know if the leaves are opposite or alternate, whether they're compound or simple, and whether they're pinnate and palmate. That's kind of fern or tree ID. This is similar, and we use this kind of basic frond division to understand how kind of describe ferns and use this to identify them. So the most basic one would be entire. And so in an entire frond, it is undivided. So on the left, you can see there walking fern again, and it has these long undivided fronds. On the right is adder's tongue. And so it has, you can already see it has a separate sterile and fertile frond, right? The fertile frond is that little spike going up the middle, and the sterile frond is the rest of it, but that's entire. It's just, there's not divided at all, right? So there's a few ferns that are entire, undivided. And then we have some that are divided, but not all the way so that they're completely divided down to the rachis. Instead, they're kind of lobed, if you will. And so if a frond is lobed, but not completely divided all the way down, we call that pinnatifid. So it's divided, but not all the way down to the central rachis. So pinnatifid spleenwort on the left and sensitive fern on the right, you can see there's leafy tissue all the way down to the rachis. So they're not fully divided. So that's considered pinnatifid. Now, if they are fully divided, and so you have completely separated into separate pinnae, like the Christmas fern, you can see that rachis and there's a separation. There's clean rachis without any leafy tissue in between each of those pinnae. That's called pinnate, right? So it's completely divided along a central rachis, and that each of those pinnae are not further divided. So the maidenhair spleenwort on the right and the Christmas fern on the left are good examples of that. Take it another step farther, and each of those pinnae are divided a little bit, but not completely separated. So in this case, there's a clear division along the central rachis, and then there's lobes after that, but it's not all the way divided down. That's called pinnate pinnatifid. And this just keeps going and going, but this is a Goldie's wood fern. You can see there's a clear first separation, but if you look close, that second separation is incomplete. Let's look a little closer here. You can see again that central rachis going from left to right here, clear division between each of these. But if you look at each of these pinnae and the secondary rachis, you can see that the division down between each of these is not complete, right? So there's leafy tissue along the rachis. So that would be a pinnate pinnatifid one. Next up, of course, would be a true bipinnate. So that means that it's twicely separated, right? So there's a central rachis, like on this rattlesnake fern, clearly separated. And if you look at each of the pinnae, they're clearly separated again into pinnules, right? So this lady fern on the right, you'd have to look a little closer to make sure, but very clear separation. So that would be bipinnate. Now, if those separations like this one are also a little divided, you could call it bipinnate pinnatifid. You can even have tri-pinnate, so it keeps going, but this is the kind of the basic way to describe how divided a fern is. Really good example is royal fern. It's one of our biggest ferns out there. You can see here, here's the central rachis, very clearly divided. And then here's the secondary rachis going off of that one, also very clearly divided. And then each of the pinnules after that are not divided at all. So it's very much a true bipinnate fern. So those are, really what we use to identify ferns would be, where are the sori? Are they separate fertile and sterile fronds? And then how divided are those fronds? So those are kind of the three major characteristics that we can use to kind of separate all of our ferns out there. So kind of getting a handle on those three things would be important. We also use things like color, size, hairiness or scaliness of the stipe and things like that. But overall, kind of those three characteristics are what you look at when you're trying to identify ferns. We'll spend the rest of the time here actually talking about ferns and how to identify some of these common ones, but I'll just mention some resources that I like. A common one out there is Ferns of Northeastern and Central North America. It's a Peterson guide. It's really simple and good. Good to kind of carry around with you. There's a little fern finder that's basically a little key. That's nice as well. There's an illustrated Flora of Illinois by Mollenbrock that has a specific edition on ferns. That's really, really good if you want to dive into Ferns of Illinois. I like this old publication from Kentucky, Fern and Fern Allies. And then there's this large manual from the Smithsonian Institute Press, the field manual. That's huge and kind of covers everything. So it may be kind of overwhelming if you're just looking at, one area, but it's kind of a reference manual, if you will. Overall, I would say if you're looking at getting just one, I would either get the Illustrated Flora of Illinois Ferns or the Peterson's Guide to Ferns. Both of those are great kind of field guides to carry around. Well, let's spend the rest of the time talking about these 10 common woodland ferns of Illinois, and we'll use some of these terminology and stuff that we just talked about to go through. So the first is ebony spleenwort. So ebony spleenwort is one of the most common ferns in woodlands across Illinois. It is a pinnate one. So the pinnate alternate along the central rachis. And then if you look at each of those pinnae, they have a little eared lobe kind of sticking on the side of them. And I'll show you a closer picture in a minute. But each of those pinnae almost looks like a little stocking or a sock. The fertile and sterile fronds are not different. Instead, all of the fronds are, they look the same. If you flip them over on the underside, they have 2 columns of elongated sori on either side of kind of the central vein of each pinnae. And they call it ebony spleenwort because the stipe and the rachis are dark purple to black in color. And this occurs really, really widespread. It can grow on rocks, cliffs, even in meadows, open woodlands, generally more dry forest or mesic forest, not the really wet forest, but super common across the state. So if you look at the underside of the pinnae, one, you can see that little auricle, that little ear or the little toe, if you will, sticking out. You can see that they alternate. There's one at a time, and really see that dark kind of wiry rachis. But the one on the left has immature, just forming sori. You can see they're kind of sickle shaped and occur along. And the one on the right is more mature. You can see that they're they've got that kind of rusty color to them, but you can still see the shape, that kind of sickle shape on each underside of each pinnae. And then just a couple other looks at it there. Really, really a common fern. It's not that big. Usually it's no more than 12 to 18 inches tall. There's a number of other spleenworts out in Illinois. The majority of the other spleenworts will occur on rocks and really not grow on soil. So ebony spleenwort can grow both on rocks and in soil, where the majority of the others will grow specifically on rocks, but just know there's a bunch of them out there. Now, a similar looking fern, and one you may be familiar with, is Christmas fern. So Christmas fern, they call it that because the leaves persist well into winter. Dark and really leathery. It is also pinnate, and it also has those eared lobes, just like the ebony spleenwort. But instead of having that wiry black rachis and stipe, instead this is a green one that can be very scaly. So it has these kind of papery, flaky scales all along it. And then instead of kind of having sori all along the underside of each of all the pinnae along each frond. Instead, it's only the outer part, the last third or so of each frond that'll have sori that's fertile. And later in the season, as those sori get mature, it kind of crinkles and wrinkles the end of that fern, and it looks distorted at the end of it. Again, this is super common. It makes those classic fiddleheads about this time of year growing. So let's look at it here. You can see the little scales and the green color of the rachis. You can see those little auricles, those little ears sticking out of each pinnae. That central picture, you can see this is the end of one kind of later in the season, and you can see it's all distorted and curved and wrinkled because of those mature sori, but below it are normal pinnae that are not distorted because they don't have any sori. So it's only the ends of the fronds that are fertile. And this is a shot from a couple days ago down here. You can see they last all winter long. So they call them Christmas fern. But just to review, these are long, skinny pinnate ferns, the two that are super common. On the left is ebony spleenwort with a dark black rachis, and the sori that are kind of sickle shaped and occur all along all pinnae. And on the right is Christmas fern with the green kind of chaffy or scaly rachis, and the sori only at the end of the leaf. And also Christmas ferns tend to be a little bigger. Next up would be cinnamon fern. So I really like cinnamon fern. It's probably one of our biggest ferns. It's very stout, a large fern. It can be over 4 feet tall. Really a neat one. It can grow on rocks. It can grow in soil. It can grow in seeps. This is, again, a very tall fern, a very big fern, and it has separate fertile and sterile fronds. So if you get that leafy frond and flip it over and you see any sori growing on it, then you know it's not going to be a cinnamon fern because all of its sori are on those little spikes, those fertile fronds. So the sterile fronds are pinnate pinnatifid, and again, very long. If you flip them over and the underside, they may be some little kind of rusty or orangey or cinnamon colored woolly hairs kind of here and there, but the fertile frond itself is really contracted, really tight, and then full of those woolly reddish brown hairs. This one can spread a bit by rhizomes, and it really grows in more high quality sites. So you can see on the left there a close-up of that fertile frond. The middle picture has both fertile and sterile fronds on there. And in the upper right picture, you can see those little tufts of woolly hairs occurring where each of the pinnae attached to the rachis. And then just a big shot of it growing there. Sometimes on the rocks, this one happens to be in a little seep. There's a couple other ferns in this same group. So one is royal fern, which again is our biggest fern. Looks quite a bit different. It's truly bipinnate, whereas cinnamon fern is pinnate pinnatifid. And then there's interrupted fern up in northern Illinois, and it's one of my favorite ferns. Instead of having separate fertile and sterile fronds, it has a section right in the middle of the frond that's fertile. So it has leafy material below, leafy material above, and then this little section in the middle. That's why they call it interrupted fern of fertile ones. So you can see that in that central picture. Really a neat fern. Next up would be bronze fern, also called cutleaf grape fern. And so this one has, again, a sterile and a fertile frond, right? The sterile fronds are bipinnate pinnatifid and strongly triangular in shape. So the overall shape of this fern is a triangle. The pinnules are rounded and have little tiny teeth on it. There is a version that's very, very dissected. That's a little less common. The fertile frond is erect, contracted, and it has those small sporangia on there that are kind of rounded. They call it bronze frond or bronze fern, I'm sorry, or grape fern, because it tends to turn a bronze or purple color in the fall. And you'll see this growing in mesic forest, woodlands, savannas, kind of throughout the state. So just some shots here of bronze fern. You can see the fertile and the sterile fronds in there, and kind of somewhat varying level of dissection between the sterile fronds here. There's a few other ones in this group. One common one is rattlesnake fern. So rattlesnake fern is in a different genus now. They used to be in the same genus. It looks a little different. The fertile frond comes out from right kind of in the middle of the leaf. It's a little more rounded, a little more dissected than the grape fern, but they do look similar. Another one of these kind of triangular ones is broad beech fern. This is another one of my favorite ferns. I love saying its name, Phagopteris hexagonoptera. It is pinnatophyte or nearly pinnate pinnatophyte. So it kind of almost fully separates all the way down, but not necessarily always. Again, very strongly triangular in shape. And those last two pinnae, the bigger two at the bottom, are kind of cocked at a weird angle. They're aimed backwards a little bit. And that's really noticeable when you see these. It really looks different. The sori are on the underside of the fronds. They're small and round, and they really don't have any indusia on them. This one spreads a lot by rhizomes. So you'll see big patches of it. And you see it in rich oak forest, coves, wooded bluffs, sites with a lot of soil fertility is where you'll find this one. But just another picture of it there. It really shows that strong triangular shape. You can see along that central rachis that it's still connected. That's why we call it pinnatophyte. It's not fully separated. And then you can see those kind of last two pinnae at the end there on the right kind of are swept back at that weird angle. And again, that's really consistent and a good way to identify broad beech fern. Another one out there that's somewhat triangular is sensitive fern. We mentioned this earlier. It does have the separate fertile and sterile fronds. The sterile fronds are strongly pinnatophyte, so they have the winging or leafy tissue along the rachis. They are often coarsely toothed, like the ones in the picture there, or round teeth. Sometimes they're almost entire though, and not toothed at all, each of those pinnae. The fertile fronds are erect. They have kind of hardened bead-like sporangia on them. And this is another rhizomatous plant that can form big patches. It grows best in partial sun or light shade, and it can form some really big patches. So again, here on the left, that's the fertile fronds. You can see those kind of rounded bead-like sporangia on them. And on the right is one sterile frond that doesn't have a lot of those rounded teething on it. But just, again, big patches. So this is a big patch of sensitive fern. They call it sensitive fern because it tends to wither right at the first sign of frost in the fall. But you can see this big patch of it, and there's some Christmas fern mixed in as well. So again, here's just 3 of those triangular shaped ferns that you might see, right? Sensitive fern, which is those rounded teeth. Broad beech fern, which has a little more dissection to it, but still kind of pinnatophyte, and has sori underneath of them. So you can find the sori on there, where a sensitive fern you won't. And then the grape fern or bronze fern, which is fully dissected into bipinnate. But they all kind of have that same triangular look, if you will. Another one out there that is kind of a spring fern that you'll find right now because it tends to wither away as the summer heat approaches, but it really co-occurs with a lot of wildflowers, is fragile fern. And so fragile fern is usually less than about 12 inches tall, pinnate pinnatophyte with really rounded pinnae, really light green in color, small rounded sori on the underside that's partially covered by an indusium. It's also rhizomatous, so you'll see big patches of it, and it occurs in areas where you have those spring wildflowers. Again, this comes out early. It's out right now in Southern Illinois, And then as summer approaches, it'll kind of wither away and disappear on the landscape often. Very small, very delicate fern, very highly dissected. It almost looks like a ragweed leaf, almost common ragweed leaf. But a neat fern. You'll see them out there quite a bit, especially this time of year. There's a couple other fragile fern species. One we already mentioned, which is bulblet fern, which will produce those little bulblets. It tends to grow on rocks more so, whereas fragile fern kind of exclusively grows in soil. A couple other lookalikes are the hairy lip fern and the blunt lobe cliff fern. They kind of have those kind of rounded, highly dissected nature, and they're small ferns. Both of these are very hairy and they grow in very dry environments, which is a different way to separate them from the fragile fern, but they do look quite a bit alike. Northern maidenhair fern is another one of my favorite ferns out there. It's so delicate looking. I really, really like this fern. It is bipinnate, right? So it has, and the rachis, it curves around, so it creates this fan shape to the whole fern, and it's kind of always flat. So it's almost horizontal in nature, or parallel to the ground, if you will. So it has these flat fronds on the top, or flat blades on the top. And then the pinnae are attached kind of at one side, and so it's flat on one side, and then it has these clefts or curves on the other side. It really gives it just an unusual look to it, with these wiry, thin, dark black stipe and rachis as well. This one's unusual, though. A lot of times you have to look very closely, but you can find the sori as that they occur right at the edge of the leaf, so much so that the leaf kind of usually curls around and hides them. So sometimes it's hard to find those sori on it. But this occurs in rich forest, ravines, coves, often really kind of high quality sites. So just a close-up look at that really delicate, those pinnae, and how they're attached on one side and straight and then kind of rounded. It almost looks a little like parsley, if you will. And then that overall fan shape to it. Just a fascinating, beautiful fern out there. And you find those, you're probably in higher quality sites. And then I think we'll have our last two ferns that kind of look alike, so we'll mention them here together. The first is lady fern. So that's another tall fern. It can get up to 3 feet, sometimes more. It's bipinnate pinnatophyte, so it's twicely divided, and then those second divisions are again kind of curved, or pinnatophyte are curved, but dissected a little bit more. The stipe and the rachis is green to almost purple in color, and there may be some scales on it. These have the sori that are located along the central vein of each pinnule, and they're kind of sickle shaped. So they're curved shape. They'll have each sorus will have an indusium attached at one side that kind of partially covers it. And this will form small colonies. It doesn't run in hugely rhizomatous, but it'll form these kind of small clumps of it. You'll find these in mesic woods, ravines, kind of below bluffs, rich sites, growing out of wet rocks as well. Really a beautiful fern. Again, you can see how dissected it is, and you can see those sickle-shaped sori on the underside of the leaf. Looking at it again, this kind of these small clusters of it that are highly dissected. The picture on the right, you can kind of see a little bit less mature, but you can see the sickle-shaped sori there. So kind of compare this one to a common lookalike, which would be our shield ferns. So we have multiple, 4 or 5 species of shield ferns. One of the most common would be marginal shield fern. And so they often are misidentified or confused with lady ferns. It's also a large fern, 2.5, 3 feet tall. Instead of being bipinnate pinnatophyte, which sometimes it is, often it's pinnate pinnatophyte. So it's only divided once, like in this picture here, but sometimes it can be divided twice. Marginal shield fern has very rounded pinnules, so it's not sharp at all. They're kind of rounded and blunt. The stipe and rachis is green, can be slightly scaly or somewhat hairless. But the big difference is the sori. So if you look on the underside of these fronds, they're going to be rounded sori that are covered in a little indusium, almost looks like a little donut, and they occur right at the margins of the pinnules. Also, this one's really not rhizomatous, but instead it forms these tight rosettes. So you have these circles of fronds that come out of the ground instead of having kind of loose clusters. This grows in similar places as lady fern. But again, flip them over, look at the underside of the leaf, and you can see these rounded donut-like sori on there that's covered. And then you can see on the right-hand picture as it's matured, that indusium starts getting broken away. But they occur right at the edge of the pinnules. And then you can see they kind of form these little tight clusters coming out of each of the fronds come out of the ground, unlike the lady fern, which is kind of more of a loose rhizomes spreading a little more. Another common shield fern is spinulose shield fern, which looks very similar, but it's sharply pointed instead of blunt. The pinnules are, as you can see there. But this group, can be somewhat difficult to identify. The very first thing to look at would be the location and the shape of the sori. That's a big way to tell them apart. And then kind of how dissected and how sharp are those pinnules. So I know we went super quick. We covered a lot of ferns. And in fact, even though I mentioned just 10, or we covered 10 in detail, we actually mentioned 30 different ferns, 29 native ferns, if you don't count the climbing fern. So I just wanted to highlight here are 28 ferns that we mentioned in this talk. And I'll leave the last one as an unfurling Christmas fern in the spring here.